We are very excited that in just a couple of minutes, we'll be launching the first part of our training series. And this series was really born out of conversations that we have been engaged in across the board with Together We Grow, around wanting to make sure that we're all sort of starting from the same place, that we have a common shared language, and two, recognizing that we as leaders in our organizations are setting the tone for our organizations, for our people, and for the industry at large. And so we wanted to respond to that request by developing a training program. And I have Philomena to thank for connecting us to Dr. Ramon. And we will get started with his first session here in just a minute. So stay tuned and we'll get started at the top of the hour. Dr. Ramon, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. What an amazing conference, huh?
Everyone is so incredible. It's fun to be with all of your friends who are just trying to make the world better, isn't it?
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, I just love this kind of collaboration.
Me too, which is why I'm so glad you're here with us today. So we'll go ahead and get started. If you are just joining us now for the first time, thank you for joining Together We Grow's annual meeting. I'd like to welcome you to the launch of our transformational training cohort. Our program today is a taster. It's the first in a 6-part series to help leaders in our industry. And if you'd like to learn more, I will put the link for signing up for our cohort in the chat again. But at this time, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Ramon Pastrano. I am so honored to have him with us here today. Dr. Ramon has over 25 years of experience in leadership amongst many different cultures around the world. He founded Impact Lives in 2007 to create a dual model of transformational leadership and social innovation. His model is designed to teach and optimize service learning experiences, transformational leadership, development, and global competencies, which lead to social innovation and produces sustainable works of social justice. So the exact wheelhouse of what Together We Grow cares about. Additionally, he promotes diversity, inclusion, and cultural awareness to help individuals reflect and strengthen their identity, wisdom, and maturity, transforming people and communities one life at a time. It is my honor to welcome you to Together We Grow's annual meeting, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Christine. Just by way of introduction, I just want to say thank you to Philomena and Lando Lakes. A lot of the things that you are going to experience here are things, that we have collaborated and have been able to execute and, try and, just continue to innovate. What I would like to do for you today is just exactly what Kristen said. I just want to give you a sample of the amazing things that we can do in this diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And I hope that what you will see here today is going to be a different take on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So for just a little bit about myself and what is my perspective with regard to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I'm from the Dominican Republic, grew up in San Juan, Puerto Rico. I came here as an immigrant. Went to school in the Midwest and eventually decided to pursue a career in retail. But soon after that, my passion for the military grew a little bit stronger and became a United States naval officer around 1985, 86, just right when the movie Top Gun came out, which kind of killed my dream to fly jets for the Navy. Nevertheless, I still, pursue, my career with a lot of passion in the military. And eventually, after serving for about 6 years, decided that I wanted to pursue a career in medical devices and surgical consultancy. So I worked for a couple of medical devices company, some here in the Twin Cities and some in New York. And after that, decided to pursue my master and my doctorate in global contextual leadership, which took me to the Middle East, to places like Jordan, Palestine, Israel, India, Malaysia, Cambodia, Japan, and of course, Latin America. So the reason for sharing this information in such a way is just to use that as a benchmark to talk about how our experiences inform the way that we think and the way that we act, the way that we process information, and the way that we produce, results. So each and every one of us in this conversation here in this room have what I call a frame of reference. A frame of reference or worldview is a coherent body of experience and associations, concepts, values, beliefs, and feelings that condition our responses to everything that is in front of us. Our frame of references then become the structure of assumptions through which we understand our experiences, and more importantly, how we make decisions. Another thing too is that even though I share that level of experiences in my life, those experiences, they also limit me. They also delimit me. For that reason, learning never stopped, especially in my personal life. Not only selectively shape and delimit my expectations, my perceptions, my cognitions and feeling, and soon after, all of the things are acting in full automatic every time that I move from one specific activity to another. Whether the activity is mental or behavioral, my unconscious brain is actually driving them. And as you probably know, 98% of all the decisions that we make, 90 to 98%, happen outside our conscious awareness. So what I want to do, today is just give you a flyby on how cultural competence, unconscious bias, system thinking, and emotional intelligence are interclosely, related, and how they do affect, our blind spot and the way that we interact with each other on a regular basis, and the way that we approach our work. So let me start with this quote. It's one of my favorite quotes. If you have been to MIT, there is a sculpture right outside one of their building, and that the inscription goes like this: "Let no one enter who cannot see that the issues outside are a mirror of the issues inside." So when organizations are calling me to help them address, certain problem or trying to solve certain, problems, one of the things that I try to help them understand is that the movement is from ego to ego, from the internal to the external, because we need to understand how the internal is informing what is out there. We are responsible for the assumptions that we make. And what you see when we talk about the system is designed to behave the way that it's behaving. And the system is a projection of our collective thinking, our collective worldview, and our collective behavior. The other quote is another one that has become very favorite of mine right now, especially in our time. One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough to think you're right, but not knowing enough to know you're wrong. And I think both of these quote illustrate the blind spot, of our time today. Dr. Otto Scharmer, senior lecturer at MIT, puts it this way: there is a blind spot in leadership, management, and social change. It is a blind spot that also applies to our everyday social experience. The blind spot concerns the inner place, the source from which we operate when we act, communicate, perceive, or think. So what he's talking about is that we can see the things that we do. We call that results. And we can see how we do it. We call that process. But what is informing the process and what is informing the results, most of us will not be able to give a clear answer. If we're asked where our actions come from, most of us will be unable to provide a clear response. So what is informing your thinking? What are the stories? What are the images that are informing, the way that you make decisions, the way that you think, what is informing your values, your beliefs, etc., which is what you're using to engage with the world, that is in front of you. So, but before we get into this important conversation, I think is very important to understand what is happening in our overarching culture. When we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and we talk about words like cultural competence, these are the things probably most talk about on a regular basis on any given day. And what I realized is that it's also one of the least understood. And the reason why is we have language, but we don't have shared meaning. So when I work with organizations, one of the first things that I try to address is, do you have shared meaning? Because if I can ask anybody here in this group to define diversity, equity, inclusion, or belonging, all of you will have a different definition for that. So the things that we know is that we agree for the most part that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging will bring benefits to organization. And those are some of those benefits will be things like increased innovation, collaboration, more profitability, employees engagement, company reputation, and that will give teams the ability or the edge when it comes to problem solving. But what is challenging is actually managing and leading in diverse environments. So this require very special care and a very special, set of skills and a strategy. Most of the time we assume that we have shared meaning and that other people see things the same way that we do. This, of course, is not true, and therefore can lead to misunderstanding when interacting with diverse people from different cultural backgrounds and with different values. So one of the things that I also like to point out right at the beginning is that culture is nonlinear, is dynamic, it's always evolving, and it's always changing. We as human beings are always growing, are maturing, are learning, are always, expanding our way of thinking. So therefore, culture is a moving target. The overarching culture is a moving target, and so are we. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's no finish line. There's no finish line because this is a living system. It's a living system of thinking and or collective thinking, acting, and behaving that is charting a course of its own. One of the biggest problems that we have right now, or challenges, is what we call the euphemism treadmill. Every day we have people trying to find a new word that might feel a little bit more sensitive or more politically correct because the previous word felt a little bit challenging, or people don't know how to cope with the words, or the word may feel threatening to them. And what happened is every time that we try to come up with a new word, the new word takes the meaning of the previous word soon after. And that's what we call the euphemism treadmill. The other issue that we find is that as we become more polarized, we can see the politicization of words and the weaponization of words. And there has been an increase on shame, guilting, and blaming, especially when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which actually have no place in this conversation. So when we talk about diversity, we want to make sure that we are thinking beyond what typically, people think, diversity is. And that is, race, ethnicity, gender, religion. We want to make sure that we are addressing the implicit dimensions of diversity, such as neurodiversity, diversity of thoughts, opinions, abilities, disabilities, and preferences, etc. So we want to make sure that when we talk about diversity, we are talking about presence of differences of all kinds. And that, to me, is one of the best ways to address, both the explicit and the explicit dimension of diversity. So that was a long introduction, but what I want to do is, again, reinforce the importance of leading with cultural and global competencies right now in our time, help you increase a little bit more awareness of your own culture, your own socialization, and the effect that it has on your worldview and your mental models and frame of references in understanding other cultures around you. And I'm going to talk a little bit about an instrument called the IDI, the Intercultural Developmental Inventory, which is an instrument, it's an inventory used to help people understand how their worldview is reacting to cultural differences and commonalities every time that we're trying to bridge those differences. And how we can use something like the IDI to help us build intercultural competence, and help your organization move from monocultural mindsets to multicultural mindsets. So one of the things that I love to do is I always like to capture, some of the concepts that I'm teaching through a video. So let me just share with you the short video, and then we can talk a little bit more about some of these blind spots.
Are you seriously considering her as a candidate?
Just don't trust
She's a woman.
She's a woman.
This is a man's
She's
job.
clearly not educated.
Really not. Does she even speak English?
That's not me. I'm not like that. You call it an honest mistake. Science calls it a blind spot. Our unconscious mind is a mysterious and powerful thing. It makes 90% of our decisions without us even knowing it. Our brains are overloaded with 11 million pieces of information every second. Yet we can only process about 40 of them. So we're wired to make cognitive shortcuts, using past experiences to make assumptions. And you know what happens when we assume. Our unconscious mind can put us on autopilot, determining where we sit, who we eat lunch with, who we turn to for advice, and who we choose to offer a helping hand. Living our lives with blind spots can put us in a tunnel. Same point of view, same decisions, same outcomes. We can find ourselves trapped in the land of snap judgments and misconceptions. We've all been on both the giving and receiving end of blind spots. Think about it. Who's talented? Who's able? Who can I trust? Who belongs? We've all been there. Blind spots are part of the human condition. Our choices have consequences for us and the people we interact with. By accepting that blind spots exist, we can stop. Imagine what possibilities exist if we could do it all over again. Different perspectives, inclusive relationships, diverse networks, better outcomes, seeing people for who they really are. People like you, with unlimited potential. We all have blind spots. Once you accept that you have them, you can choose to do something about it. It's time to check your blind spots and focus on what's possible.
Right, so the first things that we need to address is that, yeah, we all have blind spots. In fact, we have, I don't know, maybe 7.5 to 7.7 billion people in our planets, and we are all biased. That bias and that blind spot doesn't make us bad people, it makes us human. So being biased or having biases is part of our humanity. However, not being aware of those biases and allowing those biases to continue to act outside our conscious awareness, that's the responsibility that we have to, to own. So we need to ask our questions such as, what drives us to make the choices that we make? What are the, what is driving us to make the choices that we make? What causes us to choose one person over another, one thing over another? What are leaders thinking every time that they're hiring somebody or recruiting somebody? And also, as we engage with people, can we understand what is our truest motivation, especially when we are engaging with people that are different than we are? So all of these things are important to to capture as we attempt to be leaders in the DEI space. Because of course, mental distortion plus biases will lead us to make decisions that we do not want to make, and we can easily fall into those traps. One of the things that I like to talk about is this con of thinking. So we know that our thinking is driven by something. And the question, I kind of joke around a little bit with the commercial, what is in your wallet? I like to ask people, what is in your brain? What is actually informing the things that are in your brain? Where is that information coming? Because the insights that you're drawing from that information is going to affect your thinking. Your thinking eventually will affect your behavior, and the way that you make decisions is going to give you results or products maybe some that you want and maybe some that you don't want. So the critical part here is understanding what is driving, your thinking. And that's what we call illuminating the blind spot of our leadership. When we talk about also this idea of illuminating the blind spot, we also need to take into consideration our emotional intelligence. When we talk about cultural competence, when we talk about emotional intelligence, the model is the same: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship management. And one of the things that can also really affect our blind spot is where we are in what we call the mood elevator. If you look, from the neutral spot right here, curious and interested, if you look down, some of the emotion toward the bottom are a little bit, are negative emotion. And some of the emotions above the curious and interested are positive emotion. So the key here is that if you find yourself in any of this area, is to get to a point where you can be at least curious and interested to engage in whatever task or conversation, before you make any decision. Make sure that you are somewhere in a positive side of the mood elevator. Otherwise, what can happen is that if you're making decision from this part of the elevator, what's going to happen is that it's going to lower the quality of your decision making. And vice versa, if you're making decision from top of the mood elevator, what's going to happen is it will increase the quality of your decision making. So the whole point is that emotions are very powerful when it comes to the way in which the brain encode things of values. So emotion played a big role, and we need to be aware of those as well. So in order for us to really mitigate some of these potential challenges, it begins with an intentional process of self-awareness as a starting point. I call it an intentional and attentional process of self-awareness and self-discovery, which I will talk a little bit more. And we need to ask ourselves, what traps, are we, potentially can fall into, and which projects in our, that currently may be in jeopardy if we're not aware of what is informing our thinking. And also, how should we be responding to these challenges? I usually, pause here and I ask people to kind of ponder these two questions. Why leading with cultural competence should matter to me as an individual? And why leading with cultural competence should matter to us in our jobs, in our homes, in our communities? I believe that when I asked this question and then I had the opportunity to listen to people share their perspectives, pretty much we can capture what this conversation is really about. And the other things that it does is that by listening to each other, we expand our perspective. We expand our understanding of why this conversation is important. So if you get a chance to write these two questions and have an opportunity later on to ponder them, I think this will give you some really key insights into what are you thinking when you're approaching this conversation around cultural competence. When I was doing my research overseas, this is the model that really helped me engage with this conversation about transformational leadership and cultural competence and DEI and system change. And as I shared before, the process go from ego to eco, from the internal to the external. It begins with a critical approach to self-awareness and self-understanding, not just understanding who you are, but understanding how you're wired. What are your preferences? What has been your socialization like? How are your life experiences informing, the lenses through which you understand the world that is in front of you? And then when we talk about integration answers the question, who are those around me? And understanding that every time that you're engaging with people, you're engaging in different contexts. And context really matter, especially when you're trying to bridge, adapt, and shift and interact with differences of all kinds. The third one is intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is about why. What is your motivation for doing the things that you're doing? What is informing your unconscious brain What is motivating you to say the things that you say and do the things that you do? And the last one is about transformational leadership. It's about influence. It's about, as a leader, how might we create the conditions where those around us or those whom we have responsibility for may become the best version of themselves. Let's talk a little bit about the case. I think by this time, many of you have, are pretty solid in understanding the business case for diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultural competence. What we know is that every single study there that compare homogeneous group with diverse group that are cultural competent, that group that are diverse with cultural competence outperform homogeneous group every single time. And when we look at what's happening in the United States as a whole, we can see that our population is rapidly growing and changing. Right now, we have about 58 million Hispanic, Latino, 44 million African American, about 16 million Asian American, and the LGBTQ plus community is about 8 to 50 million. Within each and every one of those groups represented here, there is a wide range of dimensions of diversity and differences that are very complex. So trying to navigate all of them will represent a challenge at any given time. The other things that we need to also see is that from 2000 to 2014, most of the population growth, about 92% of the total growth in population came from multicultural group. So being relevant to the people around us, to the people that we're trying to serve, is going to be critical if we want to, again, maintain relevancy in the business that we're in. The other things that we need to consider as well is, let's take a look at intergeneration. Let's take a look at millennials, boomers, and some of these other new generations. When we look at the boomers, is less diverse, is smaller, is smaller than the millennials. Millennials are larger, more technologically savvy, and also millennials are demanding that the places where they work are culturally competent and they have a DEI plus B structure in place. And when we look at the benefit for diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is important to understand that diversity alone will not give you exactly what you want. You have to have the cultural competence. The cultural competence is the glue that will keep diversity, equity, and inclusion in place. Some of the things that you will gain as a benefit is representation of talent. Again, diverse team, your diverse team are going to outperform your homogeneous teams. You are going to be able to increase equal access to opportunity through fairness and transparency. You are going to be able to increase teamwork, collaboration, innovation, and creativity. You are going to be able to promote openness and tackle microaggressions, and provide organizational flexibility and responsiveness toward cultural competence and DEI, and belonging. So all of the things are, amazing benefits that case after case with, consistently demonstrate that organizations that are doing this work, well, are enjoying these advantages. So the question again, do we really want to make decisions without knowing what is informing them and what behavior it might drive? So that's a question that I had to ask myself every day. And that question really led me to always take time for self-reflection and trying to understand, why I'm making the decisions that I'm making in the moment, or why is my thinking going in whatever direction is going at that moment. I want to just, shift here for a moment and address the connection between cultural competence and system thinking. The reality is that you cannot do critical thinking without cultural competence. One of my favorite quotes is, again, from Peter Senge, and it's something that I have experienced in my life time after time, not only here in our country, but also outside of the United States. Sometimes we begin to address problems and develop solutions, and sooner or later, those solutions become problems themselves. It is almost like we are investing in the next set of problems, which I know is something that we don't want to do. So how might we develop the ability to critically think and systematically think so that when we are addressing problems, we make sure that we're not making the same mistake that we have made in the past. When we talk about system change or system transformation, it's about shifting the conditions that hold the problem in place. And in order to do that, we have to understand cause and effect. So this is a great model that came from Harvard Business Review. It's a model that really helped me and help leaders think through particular problems before addressing those problems. The first questions is about condition, and condition is about, are you aware of the problem that you have? Do you understand the problem that you have, and do you understand the root cause of that problem? So that's the P and the R. Are you aware of the problem? Not only are you aware of the problem, but do you understand the root cause of that problem? The second question is about concern. Do you care about the problem? And do you care about how that problem is harming people? Or do you care about the people that is being harmed by that problem? That's empathy. And the last one is correction. Do you have a strategy to address the problem? And more importantly, are you willing to do whatever it takes to solve that problem and that sacrifice? So when I work with clients and we're trying to enter into, solving and addressing, serious problem, this is one of the areas where I would really like to, to pause and stop and help them understand, what is at stake if we do not address the problem correctly. We have been conditioned in our culture to address problem at the surface. So we react to the things that are visible. We react to the symptoms rather than the cause of the problem. And as such, we continue to address the symptoms rather than the root cause. And then eventually what happened, we continue to perpetuate the problem time after time. And what I like to teach my students as well is that when you approach, problem solving, there are so many layers. We're looking at structural barriers, system disconnect, personal limitation, but at the bottom, at the root cause of most of our problems is our faulty mental models, our way of thinking through problems, and our way to approaching problem solving. If we're not aware of our blind spots, if we're not aware of how we bridge, with cultural differences, we will continue to perpetuate some of these problems. And here is a really, good, picture of what are the 6 conditions that need to, to be addressed in order to create system change. If you pay attention to the one on top, policies, practices, and resource, those are things that are at the surface. Those are things that are easier to address. I don't want to say, I don't want to simplify by saying easy, but those are things that are visible, we can see it, we can address it. But when we're talking about the next level of complexity, we're looking at things that are semi-explicit, like relationship and connection, power dynamics. And at the bottom is, of course, mental models. Most of the problem that we are trying to solve today are what we call adaptive problem, not technical problem. An adaptive problem require human transformation, not necessarily human change, human transformation. Change is doing things differently. Transformation is a new way of being, which is a little bit hard, to achieve. So this is my reality check. We cannot solve 21st century problem with 20th century mindsets. This is very similar to what Dr. Albert Einstein said, right? That the problem that we created cannot be solved at the same level of consciousness that when we created them. So therefore, our minds need to be transformed. And I say we cannot lead effectively in a multicultural world with monocultural mindsets. Our world is so diverse and so globalized that approaching this rich vastness of diversity and differences from a monocultural perspective is going to be very difficult, not only for us, but for the people that we also trying to serve. So right now, intercultural competence or cultural competence is the 3rd most necessary skill for us, in the 21st century, with acumen being number one, and of course, emotional intelligence being number two. And as I shared with you before, you cannot do critical thinking without problem solving without critical thinking, and cultural competence is a key to do that. You cannot build cross-cultural teams without cultural competence. You cannot build coalition without cultural competence. In fact, you cannot be an effective leader in the 21st century without cultural competence. But I think we need to get to, this is the part where we need to get to define cultural competence, right? So when we talk about cultural competence, we're looking about three things. The first thing is the definition, is the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures and all dimensions of diversity. That is the simple definition. And the definition has three parts, which are part of the process. The first one is being self-aware, is understanding your own worldview, the frame of references or the lenses through which you are understanding the world. The second part is developing a positive attitude toward those differences. And by developing a positive attitude, also developing a level of curiosity to try to understand those differences at the deepest level, not at the surface level, but at the subjective level. And then come the practical application part, which is having the ability to bridge, or developing the skill to bridge, to adapt, and cognitively shift. And doing that without assimilating nor conforming. So sometimes people believe that they try to equate cultural competence to assimilation and conformity, and that's not true. If you assimilate and you conform, you lose the essence of who you are in the process. So when we talk about the world being a global village or a melting pot, those things, those analogies have no room in this conversation. Both of those things, you lose the essence of who you are. And the whole idea of cultural competence is the ability to see cultural differences with such clarity and being able to leverage those differences to create inclusion and being able to create belonging by being able to acknowledge and allow people to become fully whole into the spaces that where we are working or collaborating. So, but because we have so much, an infinite amount of differences, exponentially, incalculable, it is nearly impossible for anyone to become an expert. And that is not the goal of being cultural competence. Cultural competence doesn't have anything to do with expertise. It has a lot more to do with your ability to be emotionally intelligent when it comes in the way that you deal with people, and your ability to show humility, again, be curious about those differences, connecting with people at the heart, and in some case, for some people, even showing compassion. And when I talk about compassion and empathy, those are very two different things. Empathy is putting yourself in the other person's shoes. But when we talk about compassion from the Latin, it really means to enter into the other person's suffering. That's a different level of connection, a much different level of connection. And I think right now, one of the modules that I'm teaching is compassion leadership. Is helping leaders to be more compassionate in the way that they lead, and teaching them the skills necessary to lead with compassion, especially to people that really need that level of compassion. So leading with cultural competence, what is it? How does it work? And what does it have to do with each and every one of us? Before I do that, let me just give you a quick tour on how our culture, our mindsets, and our brain is using information and reacting to this information. So when we talk about mindsets, worldview, mental model, and frame of references, what we're doing is helping people understand how the mindset shape how employees perceive their learning and work experiences, what they think about, their belief about the nature of ability, whether they feel that they belong, whether they feel personally relevant or connected to a larger purpose. So when we talk about mindsets, they also affect, the way that we interact with each other in a number of different ways. It will affect our perception, how we see people and how perceive reality. What's in your brain is also in your unconscious brain, pretty much is going to affect your attitude, how you react towards certain people, your behavior, how receptive or friendly you are towards certain people, your attention, which aspect of a person you pay most attention to, your listening skills, how much you actively listen to what certain people say, and maybe a particular group of people, or maybe a person, or maybe, there are people that you pay more attention to the listening than, to other. It will also impact your micro affirmations ability. Who do you comfort or provide affirmations versus who you are not doing it to? So all of these things will be affected by your mindsets. And the reality, again, is that we do not see things as they are. We see them as we are. We are always projecting more of who we are into what is out there. And we eventually end up creating what we expect, and we end up seeing what we expect to see. So all of that begin with a clear understanding of what's happening internally, to us. We need to have a clear understanding of how what is affecting our thinking, and how our thinking is, producing the behavior that we're seeing. When we look at culture, I love this definition by Geer Hofstede. They have done really very extensive work in different parts of the world, looking at the different dimensions of culture. He was one that I spent quite a bit of time in my research, but I love the simple definition of culture here: the collective programming of the mind. Now, if you think all of us here in this conversation, we all have a different programming in our mind. Our brain has, each and every one of us have a different, programming. And as such, we are going to see things differently. We are going to understand things differently. Therefore, it is critically important that we develop a common language and share meaning when we talk about some of these terminologies. So our experience, whether accurate or inaccurate, will affect what we believe, what we feel, what we value, and this in turn become the lenses through which we understand what is in front of us, make decisions, and eventually, produces the behavior that our products. Paying attention as where we're getting this information and how these experiences are giving us insights is going to be critical as to how we're using these filters here. When we look at your personality and primary dimensions of culture and diversity, this is what we call the core zone. This is the most difficult for people to change. Anything in this area, it is the hardest things for people to change, right? If we create systems that ask people to compromise something here, we might find ourselves in trouble. Or we create, we create a sense of exclusion for people if anything in this area is compromised. Now, there are things in this area that people internalize as part of their primary culture, and we also have to be very careful with that. This in here is what we call, in this outer, circle, is what we call the fluid zone. This is where people are, probably more, there's a willingness to, to compromise or to change or to do whatever it takes, to get along. But right here in the, the primary, the personal, and the personalities are the hardest one for people to compromise. And when you look at the 3 dimension, again, what I was referring earlier is the evaluative dimension, which is the closer to the core of who you are, will be the hardest one for people to exchange. And of course, we also need to pay attention to not only to the things that we know, but also the things that we don't know that we don't know. Lack of historical awareness can also increase our blind spots. For that reason, we always need to be, again, learner. We need to be educating ourselves, especially about people, about groups, that sometimes has been marginalized, and we don't know much about, their history. It is important that we educate ourselves so that we can make more better, decisions. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and will call it fate. That was Carl Jung. So the whole idea is, how do we illuminate the blind spot? How do we make the unconscious conscious, that we know what is in there and we can address it in a healthy and effective way? And that is what a tool like the IDI will do in this case. But before I get into the IDI, let me just quickly give you this terminology, because again, if we don't have shared meaning as we talk about some of these terms, we'll still be a little bit confused. Again, when we talk about diversity, we talk about presence of differences that really matter to people. Presence of differences that really matter to people, implicit or explicit. When we talk about inclusion, is how do you leverage those differences? What do you do with those differences that matter to people? Especially to increase collaboration, to increase innovation. And equity, I call it the science of system thinking. Your ability to see system disconnect, personal limitation, eliminating structural barriers, and creating equal access to opportunity for people. And cultural competence is the glue, again, that keep those three things together. And when you do that effectively, then what happens? You create belonging. And belonging is something that only people can tell you whether they feel like they belong or not. So when people feel like they are being seen and they're being acknowledged by their unique contribution, when they feel connected, when they feel supported, when they feel like, wow, I'm proud of this organization or this group or this team, that's what the belonging is all about. So how what can we do? How can we address diversity, equity, and inclusion in a healthy way in organizations and individual? Well, we have a tool called the IDI, the Intercultural Developmental Inventory. And this tool emerged from the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, and which help us understand how we experience differences of all kinds. And what the tool is doing is using the scale from ethnocentric to ethno-relativist to help us understand how the brain behaves at different stages when it's dealing with differences of all kinds. When we talk about ethnocentric, we're looking at cultural differences from one perspective only, our own perspective. And remember, as I said before, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are, right? So ethnocentric means I'm using my own perspective, my own life experiences, and my reality are the ones that are really valid. When we talk about ethno-relativist or ethno-relative, perspective, it means that I'm using my perspective plus the perspectives of others to understand what is in front of us. So that is what we call being multicultural minded or culturally competent. I'm using my perspective, but the perspective of others. So the question is, do you lose your perspective? And the answer is no. You expand on your perspective. And as you can see in the continuum, we have three different stages or three different experiences in the monocultural side and three different experiences in the ethno-relativist multicultural side. And I will use the IDI scale to, talk a little bit more, about it, because let me just go back here again. When we talk, before I get into the IDI, let's talk about what the tool is and what it's not. The IDI is not a cognitive tool. It's not measuring knowledge, intelligence, how many countries do you travel, how many people of color you're friend with. The IDI is not a fixing tool. So it's not approaching you from a point of deficiency. It's not none of the orientation in the IDIs can be classified as good or bad. It is a developmental tool, not a typological tool. Myers-Briggs is a typological tool. I am an ENTJ in the Myers-Briggs. That's my type, because culture is nonlinear, dynamic, and you're always growing and we're always, learning. For that reason, you are a moving target, and so is the culture. For that reason, this tool is not a fixing tool, and it is a developmental tool. So none of the orientations can be classified as good or bad, and you're moving constantly in the continuum. So what the IDI does is take a snapshot of how your life experiences is informing your behavior, your reaction to cultural differences and dimensions of diversity at any given time, every time that you're trying to bridge or reconcile those. And the orientations are, in the monocultural side, are denial, polarization, and minimization, and the multicultural side is acceptance and adaptation. So all of the orientation in the monocultural side are using one perspective. For example, denial is the more ethnocentric or more monocultural, in which have very limited ability to or cognitive categorization to see differences. Polarization is more about judging differences as us versus them, and it comes in two different manifestations. One is defense, in which I see my perspective on my culture as being the right one, and the other one is reversal, where I have more empathy to the other culture or to the other perspective, and I become more critical of my own. And then it's minimization. And minimization de-emphasizes cultural differences by focusing on commonalities, universal truth, and sameness. Now, this is the most common worldview, the most common experience when it comes to, this, continuum. About 70% of the people are in this, orientation, minimization. Now, what happened here is that by focusing on commonalities, we may ignore important cultural differences that are important to people. Organizations that are in minimizations oftentimes on board hire people for diversity because they see differences and commonalities. However, they on board for conformity or assimilation, because these commonalities and universalities are seen from the monocultural perspective of the individual or the overarching culture of the organization. And when you move to acceptance and adaptation, people feel more value, people feel more included. Acceptance is more about curiosity about cultural differences. You see patterns of differences. And when you get to adaptation, now that's when you have the ability and the skills to adapt, to shift, to connect, to navigate all these cultural, differences at the deepest level. And you do that without assimilating and without conforming. So I will stop right here and, spend the last 10 minutes maybe to answer any questions you may have. I know that was pretty quick, but what I wanted to do again was give you pretty much a flyby on some of these parts. Eventually, when we work through the 5-part, learning, transformational leadership, program, we will go deep into each of those parts.
Dr. Ramon, this was so powerful. And I did want to spend just a few moments talking about the sessions that we plan to tackle in the rest of the series, if that sounds okay, while people add any questions they might have into the chat or the Q&A. We'll be monitoring both. So today, obviously, you walked us through the role of unconscious bias and the power of awareness-based decision-making. Your reflections on many industry and company partners hiring at that minimized zone and really trying to have more of a focus on assimilation and more of that kind of colorblindness really resonated with me. And I think that what we're all trying to do, right, is to get to a place where people are seen and celebrated for their unique attributes, because that's really where we know that the power is for the business case we're hoping to see for diversity, let alone the fact that we all are happier, more productive, healthier humans when that's true. But the additional sessions that will round out the rest of our training program, if people do want to participate, include the intercultural leadership and the role of the IDI in building cultural competence. So we will have our participants take the intercultural development inventory and work with you to develop their own individualized development plan based on their results.
Yeah.
The third session will be on equity mindsets and practices for business leaders. Our fourth session is professional leadership development, particularly focusing in on transformational leadership and the role that we all have to help usher our organizations through to a place of true inclusion and belonging. Our fifth session will be on performance management, so coaching across cultural and diversity differences, which I'm really excited about. And then the final one is recruiting, hiring, and retaining. I'm also particularly excited for this session because oftentimes what we hear, and I know you know this, is like, oh, well, our candidate pool just wasn't diverse enough. And we know that we have so much work to do in the way that we're thinking about building our pipeline, the way that we're running our job postings, from sort of soup to nuts. We've got a lot of work to do. So I'm really looking forward to the upcoming sessions. Is there anything that you would want our attendees today to know about the rest of the session that we have coming up, Dr. Ramon?
Yes. We're living in very, challenging times. So, beginning the conversation with illuminating the blind spot is the foundation. I tell people we all love to do calculus with analytical geometry, but before we learn basic math, that's going to be pretty hard. So it's really scaffolding, is building and adding until you get to that point. Sometimes you feel rushed that you want to get to that particular point, but it takes time. And to do it right, you have to make sure you have a good foundation. And that foundation begins with a clear understanding of who you are. So the modules that you talk about, Christine, they build on each other. And what I do is we tweak it to make sure that they are always relevant to the moment in time that we are living.
I love that. And I know that Philomena said that she's gotten a chance to work with you in Land of Lakes for the last couple of years. And we're so grateful that she made this introduction between you and Together We Grow based on the work that they have been able to do at Land of Lakes. And we modeled this particular training program off of one that you were funded to do for the cultural institutions in the Twin Cities. You were funded by the business community to help transform the cultural institutions of the Twin Cities, which I think is such a beautiful thing to do. And so we're excited to be able to move forward this cohort of NGOs and governmental agencies, higher education and industry partners, to be able to see what we can do when we're not only working on our own work as leaders, the work of our institutions, but across the industry as well. Well, Dr. Ramon, do you have any parting words for us in the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure. One thing that I will say is there's no finish line on this work. And you have to take care of yourself. You have to, self-compassion is going to be very important. So be compassionate to yourself and understand that this is a journey. And the journey have pretty much no destination. And the whole goal is to not to give you a plan, but to give you a process that will help you navigate, your ship, as some of these storms come from time to time. So, and, hopefully we'll get you on board and we'll show you how to do some of those things.
Well, Dr. Ramon, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited for this session and the 5 others to come. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Take care.
You as well.
Bye.
All right.